Hi, good morning, everyone. As Gwen said, I'm Feneba Addo. I am I'm an associate professor of public policy at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm also an affiliate of the Cook Center, and I'm also an alum of the DITE program, cohort 10. So, yeah, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. Madeline? Oh, there we go. Okay. So as part of the Pandemic Divide book, I co-authored a chapter with Adam, who we just saw, on housing, student debt, and labor market inequality. And I feel like there's a shift from yesterday. We were talking a lot about the health impacts or the health impacts of the pandemic. Today we're kind of looking at economic fallout or the economic of the pandemic. This morning, I'm going to focus more specifically. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to talk about housing or the labor market, but you'll see how it kind of seeps in throughout my talk, but really with a focus on student debt. I was asked to talk about student debt, especially since this morning we're focused on higher education. So in November of 2015, the New York Times published this op-ed on student loan debt that focused on the plight of many college graduates. One of the people featured was Liz Kelly. She was a college graduate, mother of four, a high school teacher who owed a whopping $410,000 in federal student loans. In 2017, USA Today profiled another woman, Melissa Cephalou, and her husband, Andrew. They were two white-collar professionals saddled with $365,000 in debt. And then we also see a lot of different other newspapers, such as the Chicago Sun-Times, USA Today, focusing on these couples with, or couples or individuals with exorbitant, six-figure amounts of debt. And then, and their struggles with trying to pay it off and try to, become homeowners or, save for retirement. And these stories are quite powerful. Like there's no surprise why these were covered by the media, and they indicate a lot of economic pain that these individuals were going through. However, they tend to misrepresent the burden of debt and its implications for current and former students in this country. So one of the things that experts who have studied student loan debt will say that these examples of young adults are not really representative or indicative of the student loan debt crisis. So what am I talking about? First, they would say that student loan debt figures are not, that those figures aren't representative, as I said. There are very few students who have those really high six-figure debt amounts. They would also note that those who have those high amounts usually don't have difficulty paying them off. Why is this? Because those tend to be people who went on for graduate work or professional degrees, such as doctors and lawyers, and they accumulated much of that debt in graduate school. And their occupations allow them to pay them off. But in fact, the people who are more likely to default are those who have relatively small amounts, so about $1,000 or $2,000 amount of debt. Experts would point out that all the people profiled are four-year college graduates or more, right? They have graduate degrees, and who also tend to struggle less. What they usually or didn't recognize when we first started doing this work is that the young adults that were profiled in a lot of these articles were all white Americans. So there was a BuzzFeed article that had a story that more accurately, or we thought, reflected the empirical and racial reality of student loan debt in the United States. One woman profiled, her name was Jen, had $50,000 in debt and is now on an income-based repayment plan after struggling to repay her loans. The $50,000 is still higher than the national average, but research shows, and some of the work that I've done, that black borrowers are more deeply indebted than their white counterparts, which was alluded to in the previous panel. And in addition to accumulating more debt, Jen, like many other borrowers, struggled to repay her debt, and she had defaulted. So racial disparities in student loan default are quite massive. And black college graduates are more than 5 times likely to default on their loans in the decade following graduation than white college graduates. So these stark disparities in student loan debt accumulation and repayment make it clear that race and racial inequality are central to understanding the student loan debt landscape in the United States. and that any discussion of student loan debt that fails to consider race is missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. So so that was my slide about the shift towards kind of focusing on Black borrowers in the student loan debt discussion. So those first few paragraphs are those first set that I just read are the first paragraphs of my book, which Gwen alluded to, which will be officially published in about 2 weeks, and is co-authored with my friend and colleague Jason Houle. He's a sociologist at Dartmouth College. And the book is a culmination of work that we've explored over about 10 years, and that we've done together and both separately on this topic. So at the time, when we first started, our goal was to understand what led Black young adults to accumulate more debt than white counterparts. And what we found was that by age 25, Black college-going young adults reported nearly double the amount of debt. And if we think about that, what does that mean? That the average white borrower if they owe about $22,000, we would expect a comparable Black young adult to own about, close to $43,000 or close to $44,000, which is what this graph is showing. Let me see if I can, is this the next one? Let me see. Yeah. These are tables from the book, and they just are showing the breakdown that we did from our own analysis that shows the overall debt disparity, racial debt disparity, using our data, our nationally representative data of early millennials. And soon the questions that we started to ask, kind of multiplied. And one of the most important questions was whether all of this debt that they were accumulating, was it actually paying off for these students? Because as many may have known, is that traditionally student debt was thought of as good debt, right? It was something that you took on that leads to a college degree and a lifetime of social and economic benefits that are supposed to accompany it. And so to understand that, we had to turn to what happened after college, when young people left school and joined the labor force and began to trying to repay those debts. However, we quickly realized, we are both quantitative social scientists, that the data allowed us to only go but so far. And what we really needed to do was to take some time and speak with people, speak with the borrowers, and the former students, the graduates, the victims of predatory, as we call predatory credit markets. So over the spring, summer, and fall of 2019, we interviewed nearly 50 Black borrowers, Black student loan borrowers, all of whom attended four-year college and universities. We have reasons we can explain that later if you want to know why, but really to try to get at the causes and consequences of student loan debt, and as well as, and bring together much of, as I said, of our published and unpublished research. So, as I said, the introduction for my book is what I just started off with, which was this discrepancy in the coverage of the student loan crisis by race. In chapter 1, we summarize what we know and what we didn't know about Black-white disparities in student debt accumulation and repayment. We also introduce our interview respondents and make the case that student loan debt is racialized, which is also from a report that I published several years ago. In chapter 2 and 3, we focus on debt accumulation, how and why Black students accumulate more debt in the pursuit of a college education than their white peers. And then in chapter 3, we center on how students progress through college and how the hardships that they experience and the types of colleges that they attend leave many Black students with no choice but to borrow and keep borrowing in order to stay and complete their degrees. We then turn to the debt repayment portion of this process and tell the stories of Black young adults after they leave college and start repaying their loans. And we consider the consequences of student debt for their economic, psychological, and social well-being, and show how student loan debt has made the transition to adulthood a little bit more fragile and precarious for Black youth. And the 6th chapter, which I've highlighted there, so we explore the consequences of rising student loan debt for intergenerational inequality. And in the final chapter, we offer up what can be done. So we offer a brief synopsis of policy-based solutions to address the crisis. So one of the things that happened, so as I said, we completed our interviews in the winter of 2019, and then you know what happened, what came afterwards. And so we actually fielded a survey of our respondents in the spring of 2020, and we have a COVID afterward. So the focus of the book, while it's not on COVID, we do have this COVID afterward and the survey data of many of our respondents, and trying to look and assess how they were navigating the new landscape of with the COVID pandemic and repaying their loans. So for this morning, I'm just going to focus on two chapters, or little snippets from two of the chapters that are highlighted. One is Off to College, Into the Red, and then the sixth chapter, Student Debt and the Reproduction of the Fragile Black Middle Class. And I'll conclude with that kind of looking at the COVID, the COVID response, or what happened with COVID. So chapter 2, as I said, begins with the acceptance of college, acceptance into college, and focuses on how students and their families navigate the transition to college and fund the first year. We ask how longstanding racial inequalities in parental wealth, education, and income exacerbate Black students' need to borrow for college and complicate their transitions. So as of 2019, the median net worth of white households was about $188,000, compared with $22,000 for Black households, or 7 times as much. And so we found within our data similar disparities using the data from the National Longitudinal Study of Youth. But even more so than education or income, familial wealth is an important resource that drives racial disparities in student debt accumulation. Most obviously, we see that wealthier white families can tap into their savings or investment assets to help pay for college and give money to their children to fund their education. We see here in this table that white families have substantially more financial assets or savings than Black families, and contributed on average about $12,000 to their children over the course of their college career, whereas Black families contributed approximately about $4,200. Now, to be clear, this is not to say that Black parents do not financially support their children. And in fact, research done by actually scholars or affiliates of the Koch Center have found that despite having fewer resources, Black families are more likely to provide financial support for higher education, even if they lack the wealth limits, even if they lack the wealth, and it limits their ability to contribute as much as they would like to. So in some of our earliest work, we show that family wealth is a particularly important resource that is driving racial disparities in debt. And we ask whether parental wealth was associated with lower debt loads for young adult college goers. So not surprisingly, we see what you might expect. As parental wealth increases, debt decreases amongst the young adults. However, when we disaggregate by wealth, we find that parental wealth was strongly associated with reduced debt loads among white young adults, but wealth had almost no effect on student debt among Black young adults. So this is kind of what happens when we disaggregate the relationship. Not only are white families wealthier than Black families, but they can more easily use their wealth to reduce their children's debt, which further fuels the debt disparity. We think that this work is important because it highlights that Black families are less able to use their wealth to protect their children from a student debt burden. It's also suggestive that patterns of racial wealth inequality are being replicated by student debt. One of the things that came out that Jason and I referred to is something we called all hands on deck. So many of the people we talked to credit their extended family, aunts, uncles, grandparents, with providing them with a financial boost when they get to college. Here, Daniel acknowledged his aunt for helping him pay for unseen expenses in college when his parents could not help. Mom and dad were just always there, he says, but my aunt committed to what she called the aunt scholarship. She paid for my books every semester as long as I kept my GPA at a certain level. That was out of the kindness of her heart, which was a super duper big help. Others received substantial financial help from their grandparents, including Charity, whose grandparents paid for her rent during her first semester in college when her financial aid and student loans were not enough to cover her living expenses. And for Agnes, here it was truly an all-hands-on-deck situation. Parents, aunts, uncles, siblings, and grandparents. She says, freshman year, everybody helped in terms of extra money that I needed. Informal financial support from extended family is more common among Black families than white families, and it both reflects and can exacerbate racial wealth disparities. So for cash-strapped families, getting help from extended family members is a necessary strategy to pay for college, but it comes at a cost. Financial transfers sap grandparents, aunts, and uncles of their financial resources and diminishes their wealth. For Daniel, Agnes, Charity, and others, this means that the money they counted on in their first year of college may also not be available to them as they progress through college. And this is something that we return to in the chapter that follows. Kellyanne, she actually feels grateful and more than a little guilty. So another theme that comes up is how parents helped by taking on loans for themselves. And Kellyanne, as I said, she felt grateful and a little guilty that her mom took on so much debt for her to attend college. She says, she told me, she said that she did not want me to have to take on all that debt. So she was going to take it on for me. And so that was what all about it. Sorry, that was what it was all about. I was really grateful, but I also knew that that was kind of ridiculous about how much debt I hadn't taken on in the name of my education. By the end of her college career at a regional college in the South, she said she had around $42,000 in student debt to pay back. A high number, but again, it's on par with the average amount for Black students. At that same time, her mom had racked up nearly $100,000 in Parent Plus loans to help her cover her tuition, room and board, and other expenses not covered by Kellyanne's financial aid or loans. So unlike the federal undergraduate loans, there are no limits on PLUS loans, which means that parents can go deeper into debt than their children. And here, Alexandria had a similar story when she was at college. She says, during my college career, I took out like $20,000, and then the loans that my parents took out, I don't know the exact number, but I think it was closer to $80,000 or $90,000. So we say that Black parents are the hidden face of the student debt crisis. Decades of research, including our own, demonstrate how Black students take on substantially more debt, but far less attention has been paid to the parents of these students who themselves go into debt to fund their children's college. And we also say that Black parents have been disproportionately burdened by the growth of the PLUS loans and are more likely than white parents to borrow to pay for their children's education. So other studies have found that Black parents, especially those with low and moderate incomes, were more likely to borrow than their white counterparts. And Black families then become in this vicious intergenerational cycle, right? Because financial aid underestimates the financial need and fails to consider their lack of wealth. They go deeper into debt and to send their children to college, which further diminishes their wealth. So here, Sophia thinks about this a lot. She says she is thankful that her parents took on loans to help her pay for college, but these days she finds herself worrying about how debt is going to affect them moving forward. There's no sugarcoating it. I think the debt is the main reason why they're not going to be retiring as early as they would like to. They're approaching their 60s, and they'd like to retire by 65, but that's impossible. It's not going to happen unless we won the lottery. Retirement without any savings or very minimal savings is not possible for them. She paused. For me, my goal is to be able to help them pay that back. They don't expect it from me. I'm hoping that, I'm hoping for that because where I'm hoping to go with my career, I can pay them back. Okay. So those are just a few snippets of the kind of accumulation side of the story. So I'm going to shift now to, as I said, chapter 6, where we focus specifically on the racial wealth gap and argue that while higher education is often thought of as this engine of upward mobility and a ticket to the middle class, the student debt crisis has made the fragile Black middle class even more fragile. So when we spoke to these borrowers, many of them knew that the opportunity cost associated with debt repayment was high, right? So as Yasmin here says, she's a 32-year-old community college and 4-year college graduate, says, I would have more disposable income if I didn't have the debt. My net worth would be plus $17,000 right now if I didn't have the debt. So in the abstract sense, it has impacted it. And every month, every dollar that I put toward the debt is less money that I can save or invest in something. She's right. All else equal, by age 30, having student debt is associated with lower net worth, financial and non-financial assets compared to those without debt. If Black borrowers like Yasmin are paying down their debts while their counterparts without debt are purchasing homes and saving for retirement, then it's unlikely that they will be able to catch up or surpass them. And for those who are falling behind on their loan payments like Yasmin, which she was, their ability to save for the future and accumulate wealth is further hampered. In this way, racialized student loan debt disparities that emerge in young adult can exacerbate, as I said, racial wealth inequalities. This section this was a reoccurring theme that also came up among the people that were interviewed. I want to buy a house, but I don't think it's in the cards right now because I'm too much in debt. So this kind of delay, pushing things back, from young adulthood to later adulthood. Jaden, a 30-year-old college graduate who came from a middle-class background, doesn't even know where to begin. He feels like he can't plan for his future, let alone make big decisions like buying a house until he pays off his debt. It had made him start to question his ability to attain his goals. I think it's made me feel hesitant to want to make big financial steps in terms of like purchasing a house or starting a family. He said, knowing that I have these monthly payments looming and how much they are, it's been challenging to figure out how exactly I could begin to think about affording a house with these loans. That's one thing that's been really challenging. Jaden's hesitancy was a common refrain among our interview respondents. Here he explains how his student debt not only made it hard for him to save for buying a house, but it makes it nearly impossible to plan for a future where wealth is a possibility. If you're not able to conceive of how to achieve a particular financial goalpost, then the realization of that goal became less feasible. While several respondents talk about how student debt hampered their dreams of home ownership, others spoke about adjusting their dreams and goals for the future. Jared, a 31-year-old graduate, lightly joked that he would be downgrading his future desires and settle for a lesser alternative. I'd like to have a lot more savings. I'd say I'm doing pretty well. But had I not had student loans or had they been forgiven or something, I'd have a better car. I'd probably have a bigger house or more children, things of that nature. But I'd say I pretty much probably live the same. I don't need to have a Maserati or anything like that, but just to have the option to have that stuff is what I would be looking for. And it was not because Jared felt undeserving or his preferences had changed, but that student debt had rendered the option of setting such lofty goals out of reach. He settled for less. Jared's hopes for a nicer car or a bigger home might seem trivial in comparison to Jaden's struggles to purchase a home. But the point is that the cuts from these debts are sometimes deep and sometimes superficial. Either way, it still cuts. Our society tells children to dream big, but for Black children, the messages are, you're dreaming too big, or you have to be more realistic. Our respondents' stories highlight the economic burdens of student debt for short and long-term financial security. The stories vary in severity. For some, student debt means they will not get their dream car. For others, it makes them feel like they'll never be able to buy a home or start their families. And for those struggling the most, it cuts off opportunities, access to credit, and plunges them deeper into debt. Unlike many of their white peers, they could not rely on inheritances to improve their financial status and prayed for debt cancellation. So again, this is in 2019, okay? So kind of, where are we sitting? So their stories reflect vast racial disparities in debt, which I've alluded to, that have persisted across generations. But racial wealth disparities also increase within generations because wealth begets wealth. So here, in this figure, we see that over the course of young adulthood, we have a disparity of around $22,000 at age 25 that doubles to more than $56,000 by age 30. So Black college goers were essentially stuck in the amount of wealth that they had, barely increasing between that 5-year age gap, whereas the white wealth more than doubled. We know that social scientists, many who are in this room, have long studied the origins and reproductions of the racial wealth gap and have argued that the wealth gap represents the sedimentation of centuries of systemic inequalities and vicious racist policies, from the institution of slavery through redlining, practices that denied Black people access to home ownership, Jim Crow, and racial segregation. But when we saw the data on rising student loan debt among Black youth, we wondered whether rising debt may explain part of the story among recent cohorts of young adults. That is, does student debt help us to understand the racial wealth gaps that exist among college-going households? In another paper, we tried to answer this question, right? So we found data, and we found that the racial disparities in student debt accounted for around 13% of the racial wealth gap at age 25. In other words, if we could somehow remove that debt, snap our fingers and remove that debt disparity and make the Black debt make it equivalent to the white debt, then the racial wealth gap among college-going young adults would fall by about 13%. So as the student loan debt crisis gained national attention, the topic figured prominently during the presidential election, given its salience with young adult voters. They were really trying to increase access, turnout among young adult voters. This led many candidates vying for the Democratic nomination to center student debt-focused policy prescriptions in their campaign agendas, with many proposals, including some form of student debt forgiveness or cancellation. So here is just a kind of a summarization of some of the policy proposals or campaign proposals. We have Bernie Sanders' plan included total debt forgiveness of the outstanding $1.6 trillion debt, a cap on interest rates, an expansion of the Pell Grant program to include books, housings, and transportation fees. He also wanted students at trade or apprenticeship programs to not be charged tuition, and funding would be increased for HBCUs, tribal colleges and universities, and other minority-serving institutions. It was also the only plan to address these institutions specifically. Senator Warren's plan sought to eliminate about 95% of borrowers by canceling debt up to $50,000, $50,000 of households with incomes less than $100,000. She also proposed to eliminate tuition at public universities, and she had a way of funding her proposals. So her proposal, she wanted to create an ultra-millionaire tax, so 2% annual tax on household assets above $50 million, and an additional 1% billionaire tax, surtax, among billionaires, and an exit tax on those who renounced their U.S. citizenship in retaliation, so people who tried to flee in order to not pay the tax. Let's see, and so now the Biden plan, his plan consisted of a graduated system in which borrowers making under $25,000 would pay nothing, those making over $25,000 would be paying about 5% of their income, and any remaining loan balances would be forgiven after 20 years and would not be taxed. In addition, he wanted debt cancellation for a national community service up to 5 years, and borrowers employed at borrowers who were employed at would receive 2 years of free community college based on federal state partnerships, with 75% of the costs paid for by the federal government. So kind of thinking of this state-federal partnership. And his plan was also the only one to address bankruptcy, in that it supported student debt discharge in bankruptcy. But more specifically, we saw in the spring of 2018, a letter was sent to the current Secretary of Education that had a very clear agenda. It said the federal student loan program disproportionately impacted students of color, and the current structure and actions of the department have failed to protect these borrowers. And then in early 2019, several senators, including now Vice President Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, put out a call for stakeholder input on how to address racial disparities in student debt. So the issue of student debt and the disproportionate burden faced by students of color pursuing their post-secondary education had reached policymakers, became a central point of the media, and had a major campaign issue during the presidential election. And more recently, and more relevant to this conference, was a central part of the CARES Act passed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So as I said earlier, less than 2 months after we concluded our interviews, the COVID-19 pandemic ravaged the world. Having only recently connected with many of our respondents, we decided to check in on them between June and August of 2020, to hear how they were doing and understand how COVID and policy decisions related to student debt had interrupted their lives. So I'm going to conclude with my talk by sharing some insights from those interviews and the overall student debt policy environment. So the pandemic had been especially painful for Black Americans, who disproportionately suffered loss of life and livelihood, all while bearing witness to the brutal murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and countless others at the hands of the police. And still, the racial wealth gap continued to grow in the pandemic. Amid such pain, between Jason and I, we thought writing about racial wealth inequality and student debts felt almost trivial. But when we checked in July of 2020 to get a sense of how they were doing with their debts and how they had changed in the wake of the pandemic, many were still worried about their student debt, but they also expressed having more pressing concerns. Kellyanne said, I'm worried about my Black family in a time when systemic racism is hurting my people severely. And Dylan agreed. He said, the world is imploding and I'm Black. In March of 2020, then President Donald Trump issued the first pandemic-era moratorium on all federal student loan payments as part of the CARES Act. Overnight, millions of borrowers no longer had to make payments, and interest ceased to accrue on their balance. So to be clear, federal loans, federal student loans. And since that time, the moratorium was extended 6 times. So twice by Trump and 5 times by now President Joe Biden, with the most recent, as he said, being the last one, which is going to end on December 31st. One of the things I like to highlight when I'm interviewed and talk about this is that its inclusion within the CARES Act shed additional light on the growing importance of student loan debt as an economic stressor for many households and the negative impact that they would be facing if they forced to continue payment given substantial financial constraints. So in 2019, approximately 45 million borrowers owed over $1 trillion in education loan debt. Recent data was suggesting that 1 in 7 student loan borrowers in loan repayment are more than 90 days delinquent or in deeper default on their payments. And so even before the pandemic started, nearly 2/3 of student loan borrowers were unable to pay down the principal of the their monthly interest on their student loans, adding to rising debt balances. So in many ways, the student loan debt moratorium was a policy success. So I'll talk a little bit about policy now. And there are lessons that we can learn from it. The simplest is that in an era of what we have seen for many years of congressional gridlock, simple policies can provide immense financial relief. We also saw this with the CDC, right? The child tax credit as well. With the stroke of a pen, President Trump and Biden temporarily freed millions from the shackles of student debt. Another lesson is that policies like the student loan debt moratorium provided the most relief when they are designed to be easily accessible. So we've seen this a lot in the conversations that have been had about the now rollout of the Biden plan. The student loan pause was an opt-out program that was automatically extended to every federal student loan borrower. Unlike the Public Loan Service Forgiveness Program, or IBR, or that's income-based repayment, it required no paperwork, or to get in or stay enrolled, and no complicated bureaucratic hoops to jump through. There was no, as we say, administrative burden. And yet, as successful as the student loan pause has been, it has only been a Band-Aid on the deep wound of our uniquely American unaffordable debt finance model of higher education. Many have been left out, or were left out of part of the moratorium, particularly borrowers with private loans. In addition to the pause, the CARES Act also provided further relief to borrowers in colleges. So this was spoken about in the previous session as well. So post-secondary institutions received over $12 million in federal aid, a lifeline in the wake of massive pandemic-induced budget shortfalls. The CARES Act also allocated an additional $1.5 billion to MSIs, so minority serving institutions. So as I discussed earlier, and we go through a little bit more in depth in the book, these institutions are historically underfunded. They have less cash reserve in times like such a pandemic, and catered to students who were more vulnerable in the pandemic than their majority white institutions. We saw that these funds were immediately put to use, allowing students to shore up their budget shortfalls, allowing schools to shore up their budget shortfalls. It also allowed them the ability to provide financial aid to students in need. So one example, Florida A&M University, a historically black college in Tallahassee, used $16 million in aid to pay off the outstanding unpaid balances for all their students. So we say the lesson here is pretty simple. When institutions are properly funded, they can better invest in and support their students, reducing the need and burden of student debt. We also saw that with the American Rescue Plan, it provided additional relief to borrowers in repayment as part of the IDR plans. Borrowers were eligible to have their debts forgiven after 20 or 30 years of payment, but all debts would have been taxable. So in a provision that was put forth by Senators Bob Menendez and Elizabeth Warren, any debts that were discharged via IDR will no longer be taxable. So that was one of the first things that came out with when the Biden plan was announced. And we're also seeing massive changes with regard to the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program in order to reduce the complexity of the program as well as to reduce the administrative burden and access. So the COVID-19 pandemic laid bare the social, economic, and racial divides in the United States, but it also revealed that while money can't fix all problems, it can fix some. Just as the unemployment insurance and COVID relief stimulus checks provided economic relief for millions of Americans, the pause on student loan payments and funding to institutions of higher education provided economic relief to borrowers and institutions that serve them. Such changes are welcome and needed, but they only, as we say, nibble around the edges of the student debt crisis. If the Biden plan survives the court challenges, local loan forgiveness alone is a downstream, what we call a downstream solution to an upstream problem. Researchers believe, and many, that we need full cancellation, or at least $50,000 in cancellation, which would do more to alleviate the financial burden of student loans for Black families. We need bold, accessible, and inclusive policies that provide the most relief possible to the most borrowers, those that address those who are struggling with debt downstream, and college affordability upstream to prevent the student debt crisis at its source. Without systemic solutions to the student debt crisis, we are likely to find ourselves back where we started, with a generation of Black college goers buried in debt. So to conclude, history has shown us that pandemics, like this one, are often catalysts for massive social and economic change because they show that the status quo is untenable. As we come out of 2 years of loss, pain, and sorrow, we have an opportunity to change course and correct historical injustices. Please, let's not waste it. Thank you. So, open it up for questions, Gwen? Is that okay? Okay. I know I threw a lot at you, so please.
Okay. This is way too low. Hi, Feneba.
Hi.
Thank you.
Yes.
Congratulations on the upcoming book.
Thank you.
I have a very wordy question, but before I say that, the NIH has a loan repayment. If you do any health research, it's open till November 17th, so make sure you apply. Okay, so my question. We've been talking a lot about institutional racism. My parents' generation, Black people get educated, we're gonna help close the gap. So we know that being Black, the student
The
debt-
gap of wealth gap? The wealth gap?
Wealth, or
Okay.
earning gaps, right?
Okay.
And we know we didn't really achieve that, but that was the dream that was sold. And so it's not surprising that student debt is higher for Black Americans. But my question is, yesterday Dr. Satcher showed the picture, right? Equality and equity. There's a lot of talk about student forgiveness, but that's equality, that's not equity, that's not gonna close the gap. So why aren't we talking about this, not you, but domestically, thinking of this as two separate issues, right? Lowering student debt, but also narrowing the student debt among Black Americans. So if you can speak to why this isn't more dialogue around equity opposed to equality when it comes to student debt.
That's a great question. And I should say, I'll start by saying there are politicians, activists, so I should say that a lot of what has happened with regard to the student debt landscape has been a result of student activists and people who have been on the ground floor trying to push, and a lot of them speak to equitable solutions, not just equality. And so, for example, like the Warren plan, which is about $50,000, like that would have done more to be more inclusive of Black students because they have larger loan balances, larger average loan balances. I think, when we see on the policy landscape, a lot of times in order to get things passed, there's a lot of coalition building and alliances that have happened. And that was something that definitely presented or has happened as a result in the student loan space. And when that happens, it can push it to the forefront of a lot of politicians' agendas, but it also may minimize some of the stakeholders that are part of the larger landscape. As a result, the Biden plan was only $10,000. We do see that the Pell Grant, $20,000, which I think was a race-neutral way of trying to be more inclusive of Black households or people with lots of debt, because we're more likely to have had Pell Grants. But we do live in this policy environment where it's very hard to make race-based policies. That doesn't mean that we stop advocating for race-based policy for those of us who believe that that's what's gonna get us to equitable solutions. But I think many politicians at this time believe that it's particularly difficult to have race-based policies or race-targeted policies. I mean, I'm not sure if you're aware, there was a lawsuit that was brought in Wisconsin that said that they were, to challenge the Biden plan because they said it was race-targeted and would close the black-white wealth gap. Yeah.
Could you speak, can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to a medical student debt? And I'd just like to introduce this. I'm actually a physician, and I got interested in this issue when I was at Harvard, and I'm responsible for an alternative financial aid office at the University of Pennsylvania.
Oh, wonderful.
And I've mentored more bankers than I have physicians. And if there's anybody here who would like to speak about that afterwards, I would love to share. And I think there are very simple solutions to medical student debt, and there's an important reason for it, is because high indebtedness is then tied to entering a system where you can bill for health care, and everybody agrees we waste about $1.3 trillion, and the medical debt solution would not cost any money if you apply the single payer plan to to the financing of medical education, and Bernie Sanders talks about a single payer.
Right. And
if you use a single payer principle for the financing of medical education, that's 0.3% or 0.4% of a global single payer. So I think the solution could be painless, and if anybody's willing to listen to some ideas, I'll be glad to share them.
Yeah, two initial thoughts that come to mind is one is like some of the earliest work that was done on education loan debt was done on medical school debt. So what we learned when we, in the earliest by social scientists, I should say, was on how medical debt was influencing outcomes. In particular, the types of fields that physicians were going into, because there was this association, and some of it, I'm not sure if it's been causal, that massive debt was associated with less likely to go into kind of like family practice or pediatrics and things like that, and moving into more expensive or lucrative fields. So yes, there's also been some work that kind of shows that the high cost of medical school can be a deterrent, especially for low-income, underrepresented, absolutely. So we know a lot. The thing is that a lot of there's a how do we say this? Supply side issue with regard to like the number of people that can get accepted into medical schools, and then how innovative the medical schools are going to be with regard to their financial aid packages. So places like NYU, which have eliminated the debt, or haven't they eliminated the cost of tuition there?
Yes, one of the things that's true is that the high tuition charges and the extremely high application charges, medical applications are incredibly depressed in this country. It's about 55% of first-time applicants get into medical school.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's very expensive, and then they only accept a very
no,
very
it's
small.
not. Actually, if you look at Ontario, Canada, 15% of people who apply to medical school get in. In the United States, it's 55%.
But it hasn't really moved, right?
Sorry?
It's been that way for a very long time.
It's been like that for a very long time.
Right.
So medical schools are underapplied in the United States, and there are many. If you go to, I've talked to UNC students, and there are tons of students who become nurse practitioners or PAs simply because they find the entry-level cost applying to medical school.
And they also accumulate a lot of debt doing
And
those programs too. So
the other thing is that if you encourage, because of high debt, for people to go into high-paying specialties, then they can do unnecessary procedures and create the cost. So you want the specialists also to be frugal. You don't, in other words.
Yeah. No, I think we're agreeing with each other. I think we're agreeing with each other that that is definitely it's part of the student debt landscape. The work that we focused on was on undergraduate. We do interview some people who have gone on for graduate work, and they accumulated more debt as a result of that. But it is part of the story, and I think, and that speaks to what I was speaking about before, about like how this particular topic was able to I think, moved to the front of many agendas is because through coalition building from people who were frustrated, not just, the undergrads, but also the graduate students, the professional students as well. So many people have a stake in the outcomes of this topic, this idea. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, how are you? I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm really looking forward to your book. My name is Simone Tapp, and I am currently a third-year economics student at the illustrious North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. And I would, yes, full name, I would love to know if you were able to talk with any students who were full scholarship during your research, because I've been carrying this question around for a little bit, but would you say that the cost of student debt from prestigious institutions, your Ivies, those higher research colleges are worth more than graduating without debt from a quote-unquote regular institution in regards to closing the wealth gap?
Ooh, that's a great question. How do I want to answer that question? So yes, we spoke to people who didn't accumulate any undergraduate debt, but then subsequently went on to graduate school and accumulated debt. So in order to be a part of our respondent sample, you had to have accumulated some debt at some point. One of the things that I think about from the book and the people that we spoke to was how many spoke about their parents because they lacked wealth or they didn't have enough money to cover the cost of college, relying a lot on scholarships, putting all your eggs in baskets and trying to win scholarships or apply for scholarships, and essentially trying to navigate either, from a very early age, elementary and high school, what high schools had programs, college prep programs, tuition, assistance programs in order to make college happen, right? Because they knew that their college was going, they wanted their children to go to college, but how to make it affordable and how to get them there, just because they didn't have the funds,
Oh yeah, that
led
was
to
definitely
an
my
overabundance
reality.
or a reliance on trying to get scholarships. And what we do see from people who study higher education is that some of the most innovative places that have been the private institutions, as innovative with regard to financial aid packages. So those are the places that have, free tuition for families that make less than $150,000, right? But those are at the private institutions, not at the public institutions where most students go, right? Or most of us are located or teach those students. And so that's not to say that the students that go to the Ivies or the elite institutions don't accumulate debt, but it's also where they're more likely to work with you or find ways to kind of reduce that burden. So it's kind of hard. I'm kind of skirting like the question about whether or not it's which one is better than the other. You're going to get a different experience, and maybe you have to, depending on where you land. But we kind of do see that at those small colleges, and those selective college universities having some more of the innovative financial aid packages as well. Yeah. Thank you. Hopefully. Please let me know if I didn't answer your question. Okay, let me know. I can come back to it. Yes, sir.
So I think that was kind of a great lead up to my question. And honestly, to be honest, I was in the process of trying to think of, I'm supposed to give a lecture to my undergrad students about inequality in higher ed by race and ethnicity. And so I'm pretty much going to use a lot of your talk to talk about student loans.
That's totally fine.
So this is great. So I'm really thankful for that. I guess I got a question that's pretty related. I'm wondering how student loans affects, I guess, maybe the inputs into undergraduate education. And I guess two things I'm thinking about is a lot of people have been focused a lot on the role of for-profit private colleges and whether that has any effect on racial student loan gaps. And then the other thing I was kind of wondering too that I'm honestly a little bit more curious about is, does having less wealth, whether from your families or having to take out more student loans, does that steer undergraduate students of color into more likely to work while they're in college type of thing, instead of maybe doing something like focusing exclusively on their studies or taking those internships that'll help secure a really good job or something like that? Do you have any ideas on any of those two things?
Yes. So the answer to your second question is yes. The short answer is there is work that kind of does show the composition of one's financial aid package impacts both retention, attrition, the ability to finish, and the time to degree. There's also, there are some studies that show student debt is associated or positively associated with degree completion. But then there's also some that show that it is also associated with attrition. So you know, I don't think it's really been sorted out, just, you know, how the mechanism. As far as when you raise the question about for-profit institutions and institutional, so one of the striking findings of people who study student debt is that one of the strongest predictors of student loan debt is institutional sector and race. So Black, like work that I've done is showing Black borrowers are more likely to have more, take it on more, and have trouble repaying, and people who attend for-profit institutions have significantly larger amounts of debt and have the highest rates, some of the highest rates of loan default and delinquency. So absolutely, that is a factor. And I should say that in 2016, I was, you know, doing my work in this area, and right before the presidential election, there was a lot of movement on trying to dissolve some of these for-profit institutions, the Corinthians, you know, all those, and the landscape seemed to be that they were going to fall, that they were going to be heavily, I don't want to say prosecuted or whatever, and then that subsequently changed with the change of the administration. So it was very dependent on the administration in control, yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. Okay, quick answer. Okay, sure, yeah.
I'm not going to give the whole intro because Simone did that. As y'all see my sweatshirt, I am a senior business economics student at North Carolina A&T. My name is Nandi Whitley. And I was just wondering if you could speak about the accumulation of debt in undergraduate students who may come from middle-class families. Just meaning when I was applying to like A&T and other universities, like my parents are not rich, but we're not extremely poor, so I didn't qualify for some financial aid packages. So I was wondering if you could speak to that and those students who can't get that financial aid because their parents make too much, but not enough to fund college.
Yes, so there's an explicit part of our book that speaks to it. We call it the middle income squeeze, so the middle class squeeze, in which your income, you know, on paper looks like you are not poor, but not wealthy, but your wealth profile is such that you can't, you know, it doesn't qualify you for financial aid packages, and these are the people that are most likely to be pushed into their parents taking on Parent Plus loans, and you're taking on financial aid packages that are loan-based. Absolutely, yeah, so check out the book. Is that quick enough, Gwen? Thank you, everyone.